2007 and has been premier in the province since October 2013. Now, McNeil says he was originally going to step down back in April, but then COVID hit and he felt he had to stay on a bit longer to help manage that situation. Now, he says 2 terms is long enough, and he feels it's important to bring new energy to the party. He says he will stay on until a new leader is chosen, but there's no word on when that might happen because, as you heard him say right there, people only learned about an hour ago that he was going to resign. Let's bring in the CBC's Brett Ruskin now. Brett, I think the first question on everybody's minds, it shocked me. I covered the premiers. I had no clue. What about you?
So this morning we were having a conversation talking about, hey, you know what? We haven't really had much big news in Nova Scotia for about a week or so.
Yeah, no kidding.
That changed about 40 minutes ago when we started hearing the Premier talk about this. So 100% a surprise. This wasn't one of those things where, hey, you should be at the Premier's news conference tomorrow or the next day because wink, wink, there is some. We didn't know about this until very recently, and it sounds as if his caucus, his fellow, Liberal caucus members didn't know about it either until today. And so this definitely comes as a surprise. He is, again, the 2-term Premier who has been elected to 2 majorities, first in 2013 and then second most recently in 2017, again with both majority governments as leader of the Liberal Party. As you mentioned, he was first elected in 2003 in his riding of Annapolis. He owned a successful appliance repair shop in that community before he entered politics. And so it's certainly a surprise because, the province has been seeing lots of the Premier. Not only lots of the Nova Scotia Premier, but also lots of provincial politicians over the last few months. There's been so much self-isolation, so much people at home, watching the news, watching these innumerable news conferences that we have been showing every single day. So people have especially very recently, really kind of gotten to know the Premier a little bit more, holding those news conferences with Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Robert Strang, as well as Stephen McNeil, especially towards the beginning of the pandemic, when every single day, like clockwork, he and the doctor were on TV every day at 3 p.m. So he is certainly a figure that people know. He's certainly a figure that people recognize. Keep in mind, he's like 6.5 feet tall. I think he's 6'7". So he stands out in a crowd not only because of his stature, but also because of his position as well. So certainly a surprise. And it'll be interesting to see basically what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there has, he was asked about some of the controversies that he has faced over his term. Did that play, into his decision, do you think?
I mean, show me a politician who hasn't dealt with controversies over certainly, a 17-year career and 2 majority governments. And so it's difficult to point to one specific controversy, one thing that, brought this down, if that can be said. I don't think we're saying that he's retiring or stepping down for any specific one reason, good or bad. And so it's hard to point to, one policy item or one thing that the Premier would be making this decision based on that information. But, as we heard, he was wanted to kind of make this step a couple of months ago, back in April, and had to, delay until I don't want to call it a lull in COVID-19, but as we stand right now, Nova Scotia currently has 2 active cases, no new cases in many, many days. The situation for COVID-19, at least here in Nova Scotia, is relatively stable. And so it may have been a matter of waiting until those daily case counts had dropped from where they were in the 30 new cases, 50 new cases in some days in the April and May range, down to now in August, where we have a bit more stability in terms of the pandemic. But again, he wanted to make this decision in April, make this announcement in April. but held off until today, and held off telling people until today, even his own co-politicians, his caucus members, until today. And so he was asked the question, what's the succession plan? Who has shown interest in your job? Who do you think's next? And he says nobody knows about this job until now. And so it's hard to say who might be the next leader, but he does obviously say that he wants to infuse some more energy into the party and into government.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot, Brett. If there was anybody you could pick, I know, you knew I was going to ask you this. If there's anybody that you could pick to potentially replace him, anybody come top of mind to you, or just not yet?
I mean, there are some significant, political leaders who have been in the party for a long time. What is going to be a more interesting question is whether they, first of all, have him as leader for. I'm dodging the question, obviously. That's very,
okay.
very transparent. It's going to be interesting to see if there's kind of a shift and he moves out and there's an interim leader right away, or if he sticks around for a while. Also interesting to see if this new leader, whoever is the new leader of the Liberal Party, comes from not necessarily the old guard, but is an established politician, or if they bring in someone who perhaps doesn't have a seat. That is what we saw in Newfoundland most recently with the election of someone who didn't have a seat, who became leader and became premier. So this really is not uncharted territory, but certainly is unforeseen territory now with this sudden announcement, this relatively shocking announcement with the Premier of Nova Scotia stepping down, even though he has a majority government, even though he does not have any recent controversies to his name. And so this is something that he said he's been thinking about for a while, told his family about, told his caucus members about, and everyone else, we're just now getting in on the surprise. Hannah.
So here's a couple of names some of my colleagues are floating about, and let me throw them past you. So how about
Please.
Minister Kelly Regan is one that they're tossing around there, and the other one is Mayor Mike Savage as well. What do you think of those two names? And thank you from my colleague Greg McEachran for that.
That's interesting. I love that we have a team of people who are feeding us names through our ears.
Greg is a Liberal. I have to tell you, Greg is a Nova Scotian, and he also sits on panels as well. So he is well-versed in a lot of this.
So it would be very interesting. First of all, Kelly, both of those names, you mentioned Kelly Regan and Mayor Mike Savage, have significant political history in their family, political lineage, basically, where you have Kelly Regan related to Jeff Regan, who is the former Speaker of the House federally. You also have Mike Savage, whose father was once Premier of Nova Scotia. So I mean, really, the sky's the limit as to whether or not, again, you have an established provincial politician, or whether you dip into the mayoralty here in Nova Scotia. Again, we have a municipal election here in Halifax, in which Mayor Mike Savage has said that he plans on running. That is in October, I believe, municipally. And the next provincial election, I think we heard Stephen McNeil say at the end there, we would only have to have one by 2022, early 2022.
Yeah, that's what he mentioned.
So there is lots of flexibility to perhaps go through this municipal election and then have Mike Savage decide, perhaps based on the outcome of that October election, what his next plans might be, or if it's someone like Kelly Regan or Diana Whalen or other names that have popped up. I mean, Zach Churchill. There are many other cabinet members. Many other cabinet members who who have different skill sets and certainly different aspirations, public or private. And so you got to know that they're, in each one of those camps, they are kind of throwing out the rule book, or wiping off the risk board, or whatever, gameplay, Game of Thrones you're looking at here, because this is a whole new political game field as of an hour ago.
Absolutely. And you see how I forced you to name some people there in the end? You did a good job. Yeah.
I got there.
Yeah. Okay, so Brett, don't go anywhere. Stick around. I want you to listen along with me. NDP leader Gary Burrell just spoke outside of the Assembly. Let's listen to what he had to say about the resignation of Premier Stephen McNeil.
Turned into an historic day in Nova Scotia. However you look at it, Stephen McNeil has been a very substantial presence on the landscape of the contemporary history of our province. And to mark the moment of his decision that he'll be concluding his what is now 17 years in office it's a major moment, and I certainly acknowledge the scope of his presence in our province.
Okay, that is NDP leader Gary Burrell in Nova Scotia outside of the Assembly responding quickly to the resignation of Premier Stephen McNeil. Brett, before we let you go, I just want to get your final thoughts on everything that's happened in the past hour or so.
Well, sure. I mean, Gary Burrell, leader of the NDP party, and Stephen McNeil actually, won his first election to become premier back in 2013, beating the NDP party under a different leader, under the leadership of Darrell Dexter, who had served one term in office. So again, just to kind of recap for folks who may have just been joining us, again, we're only 2013, he was elected premier. 2017, re-elected to a second term. Premier Stephen McNeil stepping down today in what really is something that was not anticipated, not expected, and certainly how could you expect it? Because he'd been discussing it with his family, obviously, but had told his chief of staff, who was carrying, as he said, this heavy burden of this information, and only told his caucus members today, his fellow politicians today, that he was stepping down as premier. So it is very wide open now as to what happens provincially here in Nova Scotia with this unexpected stepping down resignation of the premier. He says he will stick around for a little bit to ensure a nice smooth transition to whoever the next leader is, but as to who will fill those literally large shoes is anyone's guess. Hannah.
Absolutely. Brett, I really appreciate your time. I'm going to let you get out there and get some reporting done on this too. Thank you so much for all your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Turning now to the latest from Beirut. Hundreds of thousands of people have been forced from their homes, and anger has only grown since that port blast killed at least 135 people on Tuesday. We're also getting another perspective on the sheer scale of the destruction. This is the satellite imagery showing what the port looked like before the explosion and then after. A smoking crater where the warehouse stood that housed volatile chemicals. Nearby buildings just obliterated, and a huge radius of destruction. You can even see where the force of the blast toppled a cruise liner on one pier there. Underneath all the damage, there may be many more victims as the human cost of the tragedy is still being uncovered.
First of all, the investigation must be a priority and its results must come quickly. Secondly, we have to intensify the search for victims under the rubble. The country is living a national crisis.
Here's a look at some of the first international aid into Lebanon. It's been sent by Greece and Qatar. Emergency supplies from Russia are also on the ground, arriving overnight, and more is expected today from the European Union, including 3 plane loads of medical supplies from France. International teams of rescuers are also arriving to join the ongoing search for survivors and for victims. Dozens of people remain missing, especially in the devastated neighborhoods closest to the blast zone. There is still no definitive word on what set off the more than 2,700 metric tons of highly explosive ammonium nitrate that was stored in a warehouse at the port. But negligence appears to be the focus for investigators. A number of port officials are under house arrest. So for the very latest on the ground, let's turn again to reporter Rebecca Collard. She joins me live from Beirut. So Rebecca, what's the latest there now?
Well, I'll just tell you, Hannah, I'm actually in the house of a family that is staying in their house despite the fact that they have, as you can see, no windows Most of the doors are blown out. They've been cleaning up for the last 2 days, and you can see that there is like doing volunteers on the street helping this family clean up. And we actually met her downstairs. She had the broom.